Welcome to today's deep dive. You'd think a master blueprint for a civilization would focus heavily on the macro mechanics of power.
Right, like you expect a foundational text on civilizational survival to just hand you the exact percentages for wealth taxation or maybe
Structural flowcharts for the military. Yep.
exactly the blueprints for the state houses and the courts,
But, one of the most comprehensive socioeconomic texts in human history actually left its economic tax rate completely blank.
which is wild.
It is.
Yeah.
And instead of giving you that tax rate, it legally mandated exactly when a child is allowed to knock on their parents' bedroom door.
It's just, it is the ultimate inversion of how we typically view statecraft today.
Yeah, totally backward from our modern perspective.
Right, because we assume the macro dictates the micro. We assume that, if you build a strong economy and a really formidable legal system, the citizens' private lives will just naturally align into something orderly.
That it'll just trickle down somehow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the text we are examining today operates on the exact opposite premise.
Yeah.
It argues you cannot engineer a stable macro society if the microarchitecture of human interaction is chaotic.
And that brings us to our mission for this deep dive. We are taking a sociological X-ray machine to the closing passages of Surah An-Nur from the Quran, specifically verses 58 to the end.
And we really need to establish the ground rules for this right now.
Yes, absolutely. For everyone listening, we are entirely stripping away the theological sentimentality.
And mystical interpretations today.
Right. None of the ritualistic baggage that has, layered itself over this text for centuries. We are reading this through the lens of master physiologists and systems engineers.
Just pure, rigorous socioeconomic logic.
Which is absolutely necessary, because if you look at how this specific passage is traditionally treated, it's almost always dismissed as the administrative tail end of a much more important chapter.
It really is. I mean, Surah An-Nur opens with massive, heavy-hitting public laws.
Oh yeah, the penal code, public slander, state-level enforcement, all the big controversial stuff.
Exactly. And then at the end, it just seemingly transitions into rules about prepubescent children asking permission to enter rooms and who you're allowed to eat lunch with.
Right, and historically, commentators have treated this ending as just, well, a collection of minor domestic chores tacked onto the back of the serious legal document.
But if you analyze the structural engineering of the text, that traditional view doesn't just look incomplete, it looks completely backwards.
Let's just think about this logically. If I give you a massive legal framework for a society, grand courts, economic mandates, public behavioral laws, but my system has absolutely nothing to say about how human beings process stress.
Or maintain psychological boundaries.
Right, or how they share resources in the privacy of their own homes. I haven't built a society, I've built a theatrical set, it's a facade.
I would go even further, actually. This closing passage isn't just a continuation. It is the ultimate proof of concept for the entire system.
The proof of concept, I love that phrasing.
Well, think about it. If a social code can reach from the highest communal laws of statecraft right down into the granularity of the household privacy protocols, it demonstrates that the order is total.
It applies everywhere.
Yes. It means the system recognizes that human psychology scales outward. The same friction that causes a sibling rivalry over a dinner table, if left unaddressed, is the exact same psychological friction that causes a senator to embezzle state funds.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the granularity proves the system is operating with systemic awareness at every single level.
So the granularity isn't micromanagement at all, it's consistency.
Exactly.
And this entirely upends the modern reflex to compartmentalize our lives. Like, we have this habit, and you listening right now probably do this, of putting personal ethics or domestic life in one box and politics or economics in completely separate, heavily guarded box.
But the text aggressively rejects that binary. It introduces this concept of the Deen, which is often mistranslated simply as religion.
Right.
But structurally, it reads as a comprehensive, systemic way of life.
We really have to unpack that term, Dean, because misunderstanding it just breaks the entire socioeconomic model of the text.
It does. Modern political science completely separates the state from the way of life.
Yeah.
It views the state as a neutral arbiter that just, manages the roads and collects the taxes.
While the citizens just figure out their own independent ways of living on the weekends, essentially.
Right. But here, the state authority, the caliphate, is merely the vehicle. It is just the administrative chassis. The establishment of the Deen, which is the equitable, balanced, psychologically sound system of human flourishing, is the actual destination.
You cannot separate the vehicle from the destination without crashing.
You really can't.
Let me test this vehicle and destination analogy, though. Because if the macro state is the vehicle, you'd expect the text to give you the exact dimensions of the engine.
You would.
But it doesn't. And this is the paradox I mentioned at the very beginning. The text makes a brilliant, almost dangerous comparative argument by what it details versus what it deliberately ignores.
Let's talk about the economics of that.
Yeah, take the concept of Zakat. Historically, this is the engine of economic circulation and wealth redistribution in this system. It's meant to ensure capital doesn't stagnate among the wealthy.
But the core text never sets a fixed percentage for it.
Never. The famous 2.5% rate that everyone knows today, that was a human calculation made for a specific agrarian economy, which was later just frozen by human tradition. The foundational text left it completely blank.
Let's trace the mechanics of that deliberate omission, though. The source text operates on what it calls an engine of reason.
Okay, unpack that.
It repeatedly uses the Arabic terms hakim and alim, meaning a system grounded in profound underlying wisdom and a comprehensive, almost evolutionary knowledge of human development.
Just looking at the long game.
A very long game. A system designed with that level of systemic foresight knows perfectly well that the economic needs of a state are fluid.
Right.
An agrarian 7th century desert society has entirely different revenue requirements than an industrialized 19th century society.
Which in turn looks absolutely nothing like a spacefaring, digitized, AI-driven society of the future.
Exactly. So if the text had hard-coded an exact tax rate, it would have guaranteed its own obsolescence.
It would have built a systemic clock with an expiration date.
Yeah. By leaving the economic percentages fluid, it forces the state to dynamically manage the economy based on contemporary data. It mandates the principle of circulation, but leaves the mechanics of it to the sociologists and economists of that specific era.
So hold that thought and let's contrast it with what the text does hard code. It leaves the macroeconomic tax rate fluid, but then it turns around and issues an unyielding, hyper-specific mandate about the exact times of day a child must knock on a bedroom door.
The fluidity of the macro versus the rigidity of the micro.
Yes, why do that? It fundamentally reminds me of how we build operating systems in software development.
Ah, that's an interesting angle.
Think about it. A genius developer creates a new OS. They leave the user interface, the UI, completely customizable. You want to change the layout, the color scheme, the widget placement to match current design trends. Go for it.
Right, because users want different things over time.
Exactly. The UI is fluid because user environments change. That customizable UI is the macroeconomy. But the core security kernel of the operating system, the developer hardcodes that.
They lock it down.
They lock it down behind unbreakable encryption. Because if an end user tampers with the security kernel, the entire system becomes vulnerable to malware and the machine crashes.
That is an exceptionally precise way to view it.
Yeah.
The economic variables, the administrative structures, those are the UI. They must adapt.
Right.
But human psychological needs, the developmental psychology of a child, the neurobiological requirement for adults to have protected downtime to lower their cortisol levels, those do not change.
They are immutable.
Absolutely. Currency shifts from gold coins to digital crypto, but the human nervous system is exactly the same today as it was 3,000 years ago.
Wow. So the text identifies psychological boundaries within the home as the actual security kernel of the civilization.
Yes. And we really need to pause and reflect on how dangerous it is that human history consistently gets this backward.
Oh, completely. We have this fatal tendency to freeze the UI and tamper with the kernel.
We really do. We took economic circulation, which was explicitly meant to be the dynamic, adaptable lifeblood of a society, and we froze it into static, untouchable rituals. We made the economy rigid.
And simultaneously, we look at universal ethics, the psychological boundaries of human interaction, and we treat them as highly subjective, flexible, culturally relative suggestions.
And when you reverse the rigid and the fluid like that, you invite systemic collapse.
Which is why the text steps in to bypass our flawed human trial and error process, isn't it?
Exactly. It doesn't wait for a society to eventually realize, maybe centuries later, that ignoring domestic boundaries creates broken citizens. It legislates the boundary immediately.
Let's actually look at the mechanics of that. I want to jump into verse 58.
Let's do it.
So this is the linguistic deep dive. The mandate deals with household staff, referred to structurally as those your right hands possess, and prepubescent children. The text says, Ya ayuha Latina manulirhan como Latina malaka e manukumo Latina lam yablugu al huluma minkum dalathameritin.
Meaning, let them seek your permission 3 times.
Right. The mandate isn't just some generic, hey, teach your kids to knock. It isolates 3 highly specific times of day where permission to enter a private adult space is legally required.
And the text lists them so clearly.
Mhm.
Before the Fajr dawn routine, at midday when you lay aside your garments for rest, and after the Isha evening wind down.
It isolates the pre-dawn, the afternoon slump, and the late night.
Look at the physiological reality of those 3 specific windows.
Yeah,
These are the transitional hours of the human circadian rhythm.
they really are.
They are the moments of undress, of physical exhaustion, of sleep preparation, and of waking vulnerability. And the brilliance here is the linguistic framing.
The word "ara," right?
Right. Yes. The text doesn't just say, these are times you need to sleep. It uses a very specific term. It says, thalatha aratan lakum. These are 3 aras for you.
Now, universally, the term "ara" refers to the exposed, private, vulnerable, spatial areas of the human body. It is a spatial boundary.
But here, the text takes a spatial concept and applies it to time. It says, these are 3 temporal aras for you.
That is a massive conceptual leap. The household has temporal aras just as the human body has spatial ones.
It's treating time itself as a psychological organ that requires a protective layer of clothing.
It forces the realization that privacy isn't just about hiding physical nakedness. It is about protecting psychological vulnerability.
Human beings require protected bandwidth, entirely severed from the demands of their dependents, especially their own children.
Right, because in a tribal or communal society, the instinct is constant accessibility. But constant accessibility destroys the psychological battery.
I want to push on that, actually, because the modern instinct, especially in modern intensive parenting cultures, is that a good parent is a highly accessible parent.
Oh, absolutely. The door is always open.
But this text is arguing that an always open door is a systemic failure. It is legislating privacy rights for adults against their own dependents.
Which is radical. If you step back and look at the evolutionary timeline of human ethics, society usually takes centuries of deeply damaging trial and error to figure this out.
Yep.
A culture has to raise generations of children with blurred boundaries, watch those children develop enmeshment trauma, observe how that trauma affects societal productivity, and then slowly deduce that maybe children shouldn't be barging into adult spaces.
And this text just hands the society an evolutionary shortcut. It acts as preventative systemic medicine.
The source material actually highlights this by pointing to modern, rural, or less developed communal living situations where this specific boundary still doesn't exist.
Right, where you have households where multiple generations wander freely in and out of every room.
Exactly. The psychological friction, the unspoken stress, and the subtle, inappropriate modeling that occurs in those environments is immense.
Because a child who grows up without internalizing the concept of a temporal ara, without realizing that another human being has an inherent, unviolable right to unintruded space, does not magically learn boundaries when they turn 18.
No, they don't.
They become an adult who violates boundaries on a macro level. They violate property boundaries, they violate emotional boundaries, they violate state boundaries.
So the logic follows perfectly. If you want a citizen who won't embezzle from the communal treasury, you don't start by lecturing them on financial ethics when they're 25.
You start by training their nervous system to respect a closed wooden door when they're 6.
The microhabit physically wires the brain for macro citizenship.
Precisely. And from the isolated boundary of the bedroom, the text immediately zooms out. It moves from the private resting space to the communal areas of the home, and it shifts focus from the psychological boundaries of time to the psychological boundaries of self-worth.
This brings us to the sociology of modesty and the incredibly heavy burden placed on leadership.
This transition is fascinating. We are looking at verse 24.6e, which deals with older women who are past the age of marriage and sexual anticipation.
The text introduces a leniency here, right? It says they are permitted to relax their outer garments within the home.
But, and this is a massive caveat, the text immediately qualifies this by auditing their internal psychology. It says this is permissible, provided they are not doing it with the motive of displaying adornment.
We have to isolate that word, motive. The text is not regulating fabric. It is regulating psychological intent.
And the source material we are analyzing is exceptionally clear on this point. It states explicitly that aesthetics, beauty, and adornment are not banned or demonized.
The universe itself is designed with aesthetics in mind, and appreciating beauty is a fundamental human capacity.
Right. What the system is targeting is the degradation of human capital. It is auditing the motive of turning oneself into an object.
Let's break down that degradation, because it's the sharp distinction between authentic self-expression and the desperate pursuit of external validation.
The source text uses this brilliantly painful modern example, the mummy am I presentable syndrome.
Oh, that is such a good example.
Think about what happens to a person's psychology when their primary concern upon entering a room is whether they are visually digestible to the people in it.
When a citizen's entire sense of systemic worth is tied to their aesthetic appraisal by an external audience, they have essentially reduced themselves to a sociological toy.
Yes, they've voluntarily stepped off the level playing field of being an active intellectual contributor to the society, and they've placed themselves on a display shelf to be rated.
And a resilient system cannot afford to have its citizens viewing themselves or each other as objects on a shelf. A system runs on active participants, not passive displays.
But what truly reveals the underlying mechanics of this rule is how the system applies it across different tiers of society.
Oh, right. Contrast the leniency offered to the older women in verse 24.60 with the absolute rigidity applied to the prophet's own household in a different chapter, Surah 33, verse 32.
The role model protocol.
Exactly. The wives of the prophet were the highest tier of leadership and visibility in that society, and the text hits them with a staggering double standard.
But it's the inverse of the double standard we usually see in politics today.
Totally. Usually the elite get away with everything while the commoners are punished. Here, the text explicitly tells the leadership tier, you are not like ordinary people. Their behavioral protocols were vastly stricter, and the penalties for deviation were doubled.
Because the text understands mimetic theory perfectly. It is pure, ruthless sociology.
Human beings are fundamentally mimetic creatures, right?
Yes, we unconsciously mimic the desires, behaviors, and values of the people positioned above us in the social hierarchy. The elite tier of any society, whether it's political leaders, celebrities, or influencers, dictates the cultural baseline.
So if an average citizen slips up and gives in to the motive of superficial display, it's a localized individual error. The system absorbs it.
But if the leadership tier slips up,
If the leadership tier starts prioritizing aesthetics over intellect, it triggers a cultural cascade.
the entire societal pyramid shifts.
Yeah.
Suddenly, the middle class is mimicking the superficiality of the elite, and the lower class is bankrupting themselves to mimic the middle class.
The societal gates open to absolute chaos, and the civilization's energy is redirected from innovation and solidarity toward endless, exhausting aesthetic competition.
Which is exactly why the text demands that those positioned at the center of the societal network exhibit extreme psychological discipline. They are the load-bearing pillars of the culture's values. If the pillar cracks, the roof falls.
All right, so we've mapped out the security protocols, we've secured the physical boundaries of the bedroom doors to protect against exhaustion, and we've secured the psychological boundaries of self-worth to protect against objectification.
We've built walls of privacy.
Right, but a society built entirely of walls is just a prison. At some point, the system has to force integration.
And it does this by moving from the bedroom to the dining table.
We are moving to verse 24.61, the communal eating mandate. And honestly, this might be the most radical socioeconomic legislation in the entire text.
It really is an absolute masterpiece of dismantling hierarchy. To understand its power, you have to look at the baseline of human history.
Which is highly segregated, right?
In almost every human culture, ancient and modern, eating is a highly stratified, heavily guarded activity.
Yep.
It is segregated by class, by caste, by physical ability, and by formal invitation.
Who you are allowed to break bread with is the ultimate indicator of your social rank.
Exactly.
But wait, before we unpack the verse, I have to play devil's advocate here. We just spent 20 minutes explaining how the text brilliantly engineers strict privacy. We talked about temporal auras and locked doors. Isn't mandating an open table policy where people can just walk in and eat a direct violation of the exact same privacy boundary we just established? How does a coherent system reconcile forced resource sharing with psychological privacy?
That is the exact tension the system is balancing. And it resolves it by differentiating between the vulnerable individual and the replenished participant.
Okay, explain that.
When you are exhausted, in your temporal aura, the system isolates you. It protects you with a closed door.
Right.
But the moment you emerge from that room, once your psychological battery is recharged, the system demands that you plug back into the network. Isolation cannot be the baseline of a society.
So the most universal, frictionless mechanism for reintegration is shared resources, specifically food.
Exactly. Let's look at exactly who the text forces you to share that food with.
The specificity of the list in verse 24.61 is staggering. The text reads, Laysa Allama harajun wala ala rash harajun wala marid harajun.
Meaning, There is no restriction on the blind, the lame, the sick.
Right, and it continues. Wala ala anfusikum antakulu min buyutikum aw buyuti abaikum. Meaning, or yourselves in eating from your own houses, or the houses of your fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, or friends.
Notice the deliberate sequence. Who is listed first?
The blind, the lame, and the sick. The disabled and the physically marginalized.
By explicitly listing the disabled first, before even mentioning your own family members, the text executes a targeted strike against social stigma.
Which was huge back then.
In ancient, and frankly many modern societies, the disabled were kept out of sight. They were fed in the shadows as objects of pity, or they were excluded because their presence at a formal table made the able-bodied uncomfortable.
And this text just eradicates that. It mandates that they are not charity cases. They are primary, unquestioned participants at the communal table.
And then it rolls outward, sweeping up the entire extended family and social network. Fathers, mothers, siblings, extended relatives, and finally, friends.
It completely vaporizes the concept of formal barriers. I mean, think about the friction involved in modern socializing. You need a formal reason to host, you need a gilded invitation, you stress over the menu.
This verse says, abandon the performance.
Yeah.
You do not need an invitation. You are intrinsically part of the network, and the calories of the network are fluid.
We have to connect this to the epidemic of modern alienation. The source text brings up a very painful, highly relatable reality regarding the breakdown of the family unit.
It does. When a child grows up, gets married, and establishes their own physical household, there's a natural severing that occurs.
But in modern society, that physical severing often turns into psychological severance. A son or daughter returns to their parents' home and suddenly feels like a guest.
They feel the need to ask permission to open the refrigerator.
Right. The parents feel the need to host their own child. The boundary has calcified into a wall. The shared resources are no longer shared.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But this verse actively fights that psychological calcification. By explicitly stating there is no restriction in eating from your own houses or the houses of your father's brothers, it allows for distinct physical households, which we know are necessary for privacy, but maintains a completely fluid, shared resource pool.
It mathematically expands the definition of home. It tells the married child, your distinct household is important for your rest, but your parents' table is still your table, your siblings' pantry is still your pantry.
It creates an unbreakable horizontal solidarity network.
It really is an incredible balancing act of systems engineering. It enforces the privacy of the bedroom door with an iron fist, but it violently blows the doors off the dining room.
You have absolute privacy where you are vulnerable, but total open access where resources are shared.
Which brings us to a crucial transition point. If the resources inside the house are fluid and the network is encouraged to interact constantly, how do we approach the physical boundaries of these homes?
Right. How does a citizen literally cross the threshold into a shared space without triggering a stress response in the inhabitants?
This leads seamlessly into the neurobiology and psychology of the entrance. Yes, this is still embedded within verse 24.61. There is this final injunction attached to the communal eating rules.
The greeting.
Yes, when you enter these houses, you are mandated to greet one another with a greeting from God, specifically invoking peace, the salam upon entering. And it notes, even entering your own house.
To understand the sociological weight of this, we must urgently strip away the centuries of religious conditioning wrapped around the word salam.
Because it is treated today as a throwaway greeting, a cultural hello, or, a superstitious chant you mutter to ward off evil spirits.
It is none of those things.
Yeah.
It is the verbal architecture of a stable society. It is a legally binding verbal contract of security.
If we look at the mechanics of this, I want everyone listening to picture a very common, very visceral, modern scenario. Imagine a parent coming home from work. The commute was a nightmare, the boss was hostile, the financial stress is peaking.
Their cortisol levels are through the roof.
Exactly. They walk up to their own front door, turn the key, and step inside. And the way they enter, the heavy, aggressive sigh, the slamming of the door, the sharp tone of voice, the tense body language, that entrance instantly acts as a contagion.
It injects a massive spike of tension and fear into the entire household.
The children scatter to their rooms. The spouse immediately braces for impact, going into a defensive psychological posture.
The source text points out exactly this dynamic. That stressed, unregulated entrance turns the sanctuary of the home into a hostile, unpredictable environment. It forces the dependents into a state of hypervigilance.
And children raised in a state of hypervigilance develop nervous systems that are fundamentally ill-equipped for high-trust societal cooperation later in life. They view the world as a threat.
But the socio-psychological programming of the Salam is designed to interrupt this entire biological cascade.
Because when you are legally mandated by your societal code to verbally declare peace be upon you as you cross the threshold, you cannot bypass the psychological reset.
You are doing something profound. You are standing in the doorway and declaring to your family, I am an ambassador of security to you right now. No matter what trauma I endured in the outside world today, you are safe from my stress. You are entirely safe from my anger.
You cannot honestly broadcast a contract of peace while actively behaving like a predator.
The linguistic mandate forces the stressed individual to take a breath, recalibrate their nervous system, and enter as a protector. It acts as an emotional airlock between the chaos of the macro world and the sanctuary of the micro world.
And think about how that scales. This isn't just a nice self-help tip for a happy marriage. This is macroeconomic infrastructure.
It really is.
Imagine a society as a vast, complex network of nodes. If every single node in that network is systematically programmed to broadcast safety, security, and predictability the moment it connects with another node, the entire network stabilizes.
Baseline trust is the absolute prerequisite for economic velocity.
Without that baseline of mutual declared security, trade breaks down, contracts require a massive enforcement overhead, cooperation vanishes, and the society fractures.
The trust that allows a massive trade deal to happen in the capital city is the exact same trust engineered by saying salam in the doorway.
It is breathtaking how these minor domestic rules are actually the load-bearing walls of the entire civilization.
Which brings us to the final necessary component of our deep dive. We've built the trust network, we've secured the private spaces, we've shared the resources.
But what happens when that network faces an external threat? What happens when the community needs to lift something heavy? What happens when the vehicle of the state calls for a collective mission?
This is where the text introduces the ultimate test of systemic loyalty. We're moving to verses 62 through 64, which deal with the concept of Amri James, or collective affairs.
The text pivots from domestic harmony to collective discipline. It provides a rigorous, almost ruthless definition of what it actually means to belong to this system.
It states clearly that a true believer, a true participant in the Deen, does not simply leave a communal duty without seeking explicit permission.
The source text heavily emphasizes the distinction between a casual social gathering and Amr James. We really need to define that term.
Right. Collective affairs aren't optional community picnics. When the central system or the leadership structure calls you to a collective mission, whether that's a defensive military mobilization, a massive societal infrastructure project, or a coordinated response to a community crisis, you are operating under a different set of physical laws.
You do not treat a call to action from the central system like a casual text message from a buddy.
Verse 63 says, La tajalu dua razuli bainakumu kadua badikum badan.
Yeah.
Do not treat the call of the messenger among you like the call of one of you to another.
If a friend invites you to dinner, you can say, sorry, I'm tired, I'm going to stay home. The system absorbs that friction.
But if the community is mobilizing to build a levee because a flood is coming, and you say, sorry, I'm tired, you aren't just being rude. You are actively endangering the survival of the collective.
A call to Amr James is a load-bearing responsibility, and this is where the text issues a very stark, highly specific warning against a particular psychological behavior pattern. The Arabic word used here is tataslu.
Tataslu. It is a brilliant linguistic snapshot of a behavioral flaw. The source translation for this is incredibly vivid, slipping away quietly or easing themselves out. God knows those who slip away quietly, easing themselves out. In modern sociological terms, this is the ultimate description of the free rider problem.
You listening right now, you know exactly what this looks like. Think about every group project you've ever been assigned in school, or a neighborhood committee you joined, or a massive restructuring at your workplace.
There is always a demographic of people who practice tatasulu.
Always. They want all the benefits of the community. They want the security of the locked doors. They want to eat at the open tables. They want the baseline trust.
But the moment the community faces a heavy burden, the moment the real, unglamorous, exhausting work begins, they suddenly have somewhere else to be.
They are incredibly vocal and present during the celebrations, but they strategically position themselves near the exit during the heavy lifting. They slip out the back door unnoticed.
They attempt to extract maximum value from the network while contributing minimum caloric effort. But the text warns them. God knows those who slip away quietly.
Now, we must approach this warning carefully because the traditional interpretation instantly defaults to theology here.
Let me jump in on that because this is where the modern mind usually rolls its eyes. When the text says God knows and warns against this accountability avoidance, the immediate assumption is that it's threatening the free rider with a supernatural lightning bolt.
Right. It sounds like a God will smite you kind of archaic threat. Where is the socioeconomic logic in that?
There is no supernatural lightning bolt required, and assuming there is one entirely misses the sociological lens of this text. What the text is describing here is the law of requital, or mukafari amal.
This is not theology. It is pure, unadulterated systems theory.
It is the inescapable physics of cause and effect applied to human behavior.
So if I consistently practice tatassalul, if I always sneak out of the heavy lifting, what is the systemic consequence?
Structural corrosion. If a societal structure is deeply infected by systemic accountability avoidance, if a critical mass of citizens is secretly practicing tatassalul and slipping away from their communal duties, that structure does not need divine intervention to destroy it.
It will simply collapse under its own mathematical weight.
The requital is not a listed punishment. It is the observation that a community corroded by systematic accountability avoidance will eventually have no community left to slip away from.
It's the tragedy of the commons, codified into law. If you treat the collective mission with disrespect, you dismantle the very network that guarantees your own individual survival.
You sneak out the back door to avoid the heavy lifting, only to realize months later that the roof of the house has caved in on your own dining table, because you weren't there to reinforce the walls.
And that realization brings us full circle. It brings us to the ultimate synthesis of this entire deep dive. The balance of permanence and change, the seamless integration of the macro and the micro.
Let's tie all of these threads together. Think about the arc of this text. Surah An-Nur opened with a massively powerful, uncompromising word, faradnaha.
It declared itself as mandatory, hard-hitting, unyielding legislation. It came in with the force of a constitutional decree.
And how does this powerhouse chapter close? It closes by legislating the exact time a child knocks on your bedroom door. It closes by telling you to sit at a table with your blind neighbor.
It closes by demanding you manage your stress levels as you cross the threshold of your living room and warning you not to sneak out of a group project.
The argument the text is making from beginning to end is breathtakingly cohesive. A community that only implements flashy, high-profile public laws, a community that builds grand courts, deploys massive armies, and constructs beautiful statehouses, but leaves the domestic, psychological architecture of its citizens completely untouched, is living in a catastrophic delusion.
It has built a shell.
The source material uses a beautifully implied metaphor throughout its analysis. The light, the Nur. Light can only flow properly and safely through a complete unbroken niche, a mishkat.
If the societal system is fractured at the cellular level of the household, the light leaks out. The energy dissipates. The society goes dark, no matter how shiny the state house is.
The macroeconomy is the UI, but the human heart and its boundaries are the kernel.
Which means we have to turn this diagnostic X-ray outward directly at you, the listener. If you take this socioeconomic blueprint seriously, it forces a massive audit of your own life. Look at the systems you operate within right now. Look at your workplace, look at your local community, look closely at your own household.
It is the ultimate uncomfortable diagnostic test.
Are you guilty of the exact paradox this text warns against? Are you strictly enforcing the public rules of your life, chasing the flashy metrics, the promotions, the public reputation, the political arguments, while completely letting the foundational private protocols of respect, domestic privacy, and granular accountability rot away in the background?
Because true civilization doesn't start in the courtroom.
It doesn't start with a political speech or a macroeconomic policy shift. It starts with who knocks before they enter. It starts with who you allow at your table. It starts with the baseline of security you offer your dependents when you walk through the door.
And if this diagnostic X-ray is showing murky, fractured lines in your daily habits, it doesn't matter how good your macro goals are.
It is time to fix the security kernel before the whole system inevitably crashes.